The lamp oil was burning low when Thomas finally slammed his fist against the wooden table, making the tin plates rattle like his breaking heart. His wife Sarah stood across from him, tears streaming down her face, her hands trembling as she tried to speak through sobs that wouldn't let the words come clean. Between them stood Clara, the maid they'd brought into their home 6 months ago, her face painted with false tears, her voice sweet as poisoned honey as she whispered how sorry she was that things had come to this. Thomas could barely look at his wife. The woman he'd loved for 12 years now seemed like a stranger wrapped in lies. Clara had shown him the torn dress, the bruises on her arms, told him stories of how Sarah had grown cruel and jealous, how his wife had accused her of terrible things, had even struck her when Thomas was away working the ranch. And he'd believed it. God forgive him. He'd believed every word. Sarah's voice cracked as she begged him to listen, to really see what was happening, but anger had made him deaf. He'd already made his decision. Tomorrow, Sarah would leave. Clara would stay to help him manage the house, just until things settled, just until he could think straight. But then Sarah did something that stopped his heart cold. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small leather journal, its pages worn and marked. She didn't hand it to him. She simply let it fall to the table between them, and in the flickering lamplight, Clara's face changed for just 1 second, a flash of pure terror that vanished as quick as lightning, replaced again by that mask of wounded innocence. "Read it," Sarah whispered, her voice finally steady, though her whole body shook. "Read what she wrote about us, about you, about everything she planned from the very first day she walked through our door." The silence that followed was so heavy it could have buried them all. "Now tell me something, friend. Have you ever trusted someone so completely that you couldn't see the wolf hiding beneath the sheepskin? Have you ever let a stranger into your home, into your life, and watched them slowly poison everything you'd built with your own 2 hands? What would you do if you discovered that someone you'd defended, someone you'd protected against the person you loved most, had been playing you like a fiddle from the very start? Would you have the courage to face what you'd done, or would pride keep you blind until there was nothing left to save? Sometimes the worst betrayals don't come from enemies. They come wearing a smile, offering help when you're tired, whispering comfort when you're weak. And by the time you see the truth, the venom's already in your veins. This is a story about that kind of betrayal, and about whether love can survive when trust has been burned to ashes. It had started simple enough, the way most destruction does. Sarah and Thomas had been struggling. The ranch demanded everything Thomas had, dawn to dusk and beyond. Sarah was doing the work of 3 women, cooking, cleaning, mending, managing the books, tending the vegetable garden, caring for the animals when Thomas was out on the range. She never complained, but Thomas could see the exhaustion settling into her bones, aging her before her time. When Clara knocked on their door last spring, she seemed like an answer to a prayer they hadn't even spoken. She was young, maybe 25, with sad eyes and a story about fleeing an abusive husband back east. She needed work, needed a place to stay, and would be grateful for anything they could offer. Sarah's kind heart opened immediately. Thomas was more cautious, but he saw how much his wife needed the help, saw the hope in Sarah's eyes at the thought of sharing the burden. Those first weeks, Clara was perfect. She worked hard, kept quiet, never asked for more than she was given. She praised Sarah's cooking,
admired how Sarah kept the home, seemed grateful for every small kindness. Thomas barely noticed her, which was exactly what Clara wanted. But she noticed him. Oh, she noticed everything. Clara watched how Thomas would come in tired and barely speak, how he'd eat his dinner distracted, and how the stress of keeping the ranch afloat was grinding him down. She watched how Sarah, exhausted herself, sometimes met his silence with her own, how small distances were forming in a marriage that had forgotten how to tend its own garden while caring for everything else. And Clara saw her opportunity. It started with small things. She'd bring Thomas coffee in the morning with a smile that lingered just a moment too long. She'd laugh at things he said that weren't particularly funny. When Sarah was in another room, Clara would ask Thomas about his day, actually listen, make him feel heard in a way he'd been missing without even realizing it. Then came the whispers, gentle at first, almost innocent. She'd mentioned to Thomas how tired Sarah seemed, how perhaps the housework was too much for her, how maybe Sarah resented all they'd done to help Clara. She planted seeds of doubt so small they seemed like dust, nothing worth noticing. To Sarah, Clara became a different creature. When Thomas was around, she was helpful and deferring. When they were alone, her helpfulness curdled into something else. She'd rearrange things Sarah had organized, then apologize sweetly when Sarah corrected her. She'd make mistakes in the kitchen that created more work, not less. She'd sigh loudly when given tasks, just quiet enough that Thomas never heard, just loud enough that Sarah couldn't ignore it. Sarah felt the poison spreading, but couldn't name it. She told Thomas something felt wrong, that Clara wasn't what she seemed, but Thomas only saw a woman who'd helped ease his wife's burden, and a wife who seemed inexplicably unhappy with the help. The journal was Clara's mistake, her only one. She'd been documenting everything, not as it truly was, but as she planned to claim it had been, a record of abuse that never happened, written in her own hand to seem like desperate notes from a victim. But she'd written more than that. She'd written her real thoughts too, private pages where she'd admitted what she was doing, how she was doing it, why she was doing it. She'd written about how she'd chosen their home deliberately, how she'd watched them in town and seen a tired couple, a strong man who wasn't being appreciated enough, a woman too exhausted to guard what she had. She'd written about how easy it was to make Thomas doubt, how satisfying it would be when Sarah was finally gone and Clara could step into the life she deserved. She'd written about how she'd done this before, 2 times before, and how those men had never realized the truth until it was far too late. Sarah had found the journal hidden in Clara's room while putting away laundry. She'd read it with shaking hands, her heart breaking not just from the betrayal, but from the realization that Thomas had already stopped believing her, that she might show him proof and still lose everything.
Thomas read by lamplight while both women watched him. The pages turned slowly, each one driving a nail deeper into his heart. He saw Clara's careful plotting, written in her own elegant handwriting. He saw how she'd studied them, manipulated them, planned to destroy their marriage and take Sarah's place. He saw the names of other men she'd done this to, other homes she'd infiltrated like a cancer. When he finally looked up, his face had aged years in an hour. Clara ran. She didn't even try to explain, didn't attempt one more lie. She grabbed her coat and fled into the night, vanishing the way she'd appeared, sudden and complete, leaving nothing but destruction behind. But her leaving didn't fix what she'd broken. Thomas looked at his wife, this woman he'd loved since he was barely more than a boy, and saw how close he'd come to throwing her away. He saw every moment he believed a stranger over his own wife, every time he'd let doubt crowd out trust, every instance where his pride and exhaustion had made him blind to what was right in front of him. Sarah stood on the other side of that table, her heart shattered into pieces she didn't know how to pick up. Because even though the truth had won, even though Clara was gone, Thomas had still chosen to believe the lies. He'd still been ready to send her away. That wound wouldn't heal just because the knife had been removed. They stood in silence for a long time, the lamp burning lower, the night pressing against the windows. Finally, Thomas spoke. His voice was broken, humble, barely more than a whisper. He didn't ask for forgiveness because he knew he didn't deserve it. He simply told the truth. He'd failed her. He'd been so tired, so distracted by the weight of providing and protecting, that he'd forgotten to actually see the person he was working so hard for. He'd let a wolf into their home and had been ready to sacrifice the shepherd to save the sheep. Sarah could have left. Part of her wanted to. Part of her needed him to understand that trust, once shattered, doesn't just magically piece itself back together. But Sarah had loved this man for 12 years. She knew the difference between a man who was cruel and a man who'd been fooled. She knew that pride and exhaustion and cunningly planted doubt could make even good people do terrible things. She knew that everyone, even Thomas, even herself, was capable of being deceived when someone was skilled enough at lying. What she said next would define the rest of their lives. She told him that forgiveness wasn't the same as forgetting, that she'd stay, but things had to change. They had to change. He had to learn to listen even when he was tired, to trust even when doubt whispered. She had to learn to demand that trust, to refuse to accept silence as a substitute for communication. They had to rebuild what Clara had tried to destroy, but this time build it stronger, with better walls and foundations that couldn't be shaken by the next storm. Love without trust is just shared loneliness. Trust without communication is just blind faith waiting to be betrayed. They learned that the hardest way possible. The months that followed weren't easy. There were hard conversations and harder silences. There were moments when the wound felt fresh again, when doubt tried to creep back in from both sides. But they chose each other, day after difficult day, until the choosing became natural again, until trust rebuilt itself through action rather than words. And Thomas never forgot the lesson that almost cost him everything, that kindness without wisdom is just an invitation for wolves, that the people we love most deserve our belief and our protection, not the other way around. And when someone tries to drive a wedge between you and those you love, the wedge is the weapon, and you don't have to let it land. In the end, love didn't conquer all by itself. It took truth, humility, forgiveness, and work. It took both of them willing to look at their own failures and build something better. But it survived. And sometimes survival is the greatest victory of all.
Some betrayals come with a knife in the dark. Others come with a smile and an offer to help carry your load. The hardest ones to spot are the ones wearing kindness like a mask, slowly poisoning what you've built until you can't remember what it felt like before the venom spread. But here's what Clara never understood. Real love, The kind that's built on more than just comfort and habit, can survive being tested. It might break, it might scar, but if both people are willing to do the hard work of rebuilding, it can come back stronger than the lies that tried to destroy it. If this story touched something in your heart, if it reminded you that trust is a treasure worth guarding, and love is a garden that needs tending, then don't ride off into the sunset just yet. There are more tales waiting under these frontier skies. Stories of hearts broken and healed, of love tested and proven, of lessons learned the hard way on life's roughest trails. Subscribe to Frontier Love Tales, where every story carries a piece of truth about what it means to love, to trust, and to fight for what matters most. Because out here on the frontier, love still rides. Sometimes it stumbles, sometimes it falls, but if it's real, it always gets back in the saddle. Until the next tale, friend, keep your heart open, your eyes clear, and your trust reserved for those who've earned it.